Good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Centrum Badań Literatury dla Dzieci i Młodzieży for inviting me. I am honored and excited to be part of this series. Now let me share my screen with you. It might take a while, okay? So let's be patient. So the title of today's lecture is Indigenous Futurisms and the Young Adult Dystopia, reading Cherie Dimaline's The Marrow, Thieves and Hunting by Stars. First of all, we need to stop for a second and concentrate on the term Indigenous Futurisms. So the term is not homogeneous. That's why today our context is North America. Cherie Dimaline is Canadian Métis writer, and her story takes place, or the story of the duology, The Marrow, Thieves and Hunting by Stars, takes place in Canada and in the United States. So let's remember, our context today is only North America, okay? So I will start by reading a fragment from the second novel, from Hunting by Stars. And I want you to pay attention to this fragment because we are going to come back to it later. So, Mig once lit a sprig of white sage and placed it to burn on a rock in front of the small fire. White sage was precious because it wasn't from this territory. It was one of the ways we knew how important we were, even now, especially now. We were worth that cumulus smoke. We were as necessary as this medicine. We leaned in closer, our shoulders touching, reminding us we were a circle, no matter how much smaller that circle had become. It's time for story. So the person speaking here is Mig once. Mig. He's an Indigenous elder speaking to the group of Indigenous youth he's guiding north through what remains of Canada. He opens his palm, presses it to the ground to indicate the Indigenous ground, and he begins. Remember once again the scene. We are going to come back to it later. Now, I will talk a little bit about the structure of this lecture. So first of all, I will introduce the novels and the field of Indigenous futurisms, locating the duology within that tradition and at the same time disentangling it from Western dystopian genre. I will then address the methodological question that faces any non-Indigenous scholar approaching Indigenous texts, and I will explain the reading practice that I follow. From there, we move into the analysis. First of all, we look at how Sarah Ahmed's concept of affect aliens describes the settler state's attitude towards the Indigenous population. Next, we examine how bone marrow extraction works and why it is doomed to fail. Then we turn to French's coming-of-age story and what it reveals about the difference between young adult dystopia and Indigenous futurisms, and let's remember it's always North American context. And finally, we analyze what kind of hope the novels make available. So let's start with the author. So Cherie Dimaline is a Canadian Métis writer. She writes both for teenagers, for young adults, but also for adults. And The Marrow, Thieves, published in 2017, has become one of the most acclaimed and widely read young adult novels in recent Canadian literary history. It won multiple awards. You can see some of the awards on the cover of the book, on the slide. Crossed over to substantial adult readership, which is not uncommon for young adult speculative fiction, and very importantly, has been adopted into school curricula across Canada. Dimaline originally did not intend to write a sequel, but while she was visiting reservations, while she was talking to teenagers, they simply booed her because they wanted a sequel. And what they wanted to know was what was going to happen to Frenchie and Rose. Frenchie and Rose are two of the main protagonists, so they were super interested in what was going to happen to them. So as a consequence, Dimaline wrote Hunting by Stars, which was published in 2021. And this duology demonstrated commercially, critically, and I think super important institutionally, that young adult Indigenous speculative fiction is capable of reaching wide readership while making no concessions to settler expectations about what Indigenous storytelling should look like. Now, what happens in the duology? Dimaline takes us to the near future. Climate collapse driven by human activity has resulted in massive flooding of coastal regions, triggered global migration, and plummeting fertility rates. So far, nothing special. These are themes that are quite typical for speculative fiction and nowadays. However, there is one element that is quite different, and this is a pandemic of dreamlessness. So in the novels, people gradually lost their ability to dream, and the consequences are very dire. So first of all, there is apathy, later on irritability, and it all ends in madness. So the story takes place in Canada, where the settler state has responded by reviving, and expanding the residential school system. The goal is to harvest Indigenous bone marrow for the dreams it carries. It was discovered that Indigenous population never stopped dreaming. That's why now they are hunted for their bone marrow. Now, who are the protagonists? We have already met Miigwens, the elder who leads a small community of Indigenous children and teenagers northwards, where it is thought to be safer. He's not only their guide, but the closest thing to family the young people have. Their parents had been either killed or had been kidnapped and placed into the residential school system. Now, Mick safeguards Indigenous history and knowledge by telling story, an evolving communal narrative of the Indigenous past, traditions, and teachings told around the fire at night. Minerva is the other elder of the group, a fluent speaker of her ancestral language. The community tries and fails to rescue her after she is captured, and her loss is one of the most distressing moments in the novels. Frenchie is a Métis teenager who lost his mother to the school system, was separated from his older brother Mitch, and finds his father in the community the group encounters along the way. Frenchie is the main focalizer of the narrative. We see most of the story through his eyes, and his coming of age is one of the duology's central threads. Now, Rose, his partner, is a teenager of Black and Indigenous heritage traveling with the group. She's fierce and she's super committed to the chosen family. Now, there is one more protagonist that young adult dystopia seldom gives us in this form, and it's the community itself. In Dimaline's duology, the community is not backdrop to an individual hero. It is itself a narrative subject, and it must survive. And it is also worth surviving for. Now, in the sequel, Hunted by Stars, Frenchie is separated from his community, captured, and taken into the residential school system. There he has to navigate survival from the inside without betraying the people he loves and without becoming what the school system is designed to make him. Now we are going to have a look at genre conventions that duology uses and then exceeds. So when we look at the novels, they look at first sight as young adult dystopia or critical dystopia or post-apocalyptic narrative. Now there is a difference though. These forms assume that the catastrophe is speculative, a possible future to be avoided. For Dimaline's characters, however, the catastrophe is not possible, but ever-present and continuous. Frenchie and Mitch's mother, Mary, says, "There were generations in our family where all we did was move, first by choice, then every time that black cars came from town and burnt out our homes along the roadside. Now the cars are here again." That is why I situate the duology within Indigenous futurisms rather than Western dystopian tradition exclusively. Grace Dillon, she's an Anishinaabe scholar, defines the term in her foundational anthology, Walking the Clouds. Indigenous futurisms, according to her, is a tradition of speculative writing by Indigenous authors which concentrates on Indigenous perspective, Indigenous epistemologies, and Indigenous temporal frameworks. and it is not a subgenre of Western science fiction or dystopia. As I have already mentioned, in indigenous futurisms, the apocalypse is not a future event, but a past one, and the colonial encounter is an ongoing structure. The work of speculative writing is the imagining of indigenous continuance. So we are not looking back to some kind of finished imperial history, but to the apocalypse that is ongoing. Now, similarly, Cale White, a Potawatomi scholar and activist, argues that indigenous perspectives on climate change situate the present time as already dystopian. Other scholars recognize that too. So Candice Callison, that Kyle White mentions, notes that the hardships many non-indigenous people dread most from the climate crisis, and here we recognize them, so ecosystem collapse, species loss, economic crash, drastic relocation, cultural disintegration, are the ones indigenous peoples have already endured through colonialism. The current situation is the continuation of a long colonial history. As Daniel Heath Justice, a Cherokee scholar, writes, today's indigenous people in North America are the descendants of those who survived the colonizing apocalypse and that started in 1942 in 1492 and continues today. Now, indigenous futurisms is a distinct tradition with its own protagonists: elders, youth, non-human beings, spirits, communities, and the land itself, and its own relationship to time. Where Western speculative fiction normally imagines futures from fairly stable present, indigenous futurisms writes from within what Dylan calls native slipstream: pasts, presents, and futures that flow together like currents in a navigable stream. What we have here is not a linear progression from past through present to future, but a simultaneous unfolding in which ancestors and descendants are present to one another. Time and community work differently here, and this generates a different type of narrative. The tradition has its own vocabulary for catastrophe. Lawrence Cross, an Anishinaabe scholar writing about Anishinaabe experience and cited by Dylan, describes the colonial encounter as producing the state of akosi. And he describes this as condition of imbalance, of being out of relation with the world, perpetuated by what he calls terminal creeds. And they are for them belief systems that justify extraction, elimination, and severing of relations. Now, the antidote is bimadiziwi, a state of balance, the right relation, maintained through practice, and this is very important in our narrative, in the duology. So maintained through practice, language, and story, and we'll see later on in the close readings how important they are. This framework gives us not only a diagnosis of what has gone wrong, but an aim for what the community is actively maintaining against the conditions designed to destroy it. So Dimaline's duology draws on this concept throughout, and we will see some of them at work in the close readings that follow. The next question is methodological, and the questions that I'm going to read are the questions that I was asking myself when I started reading indigenous texts, and I was asking myself how am I supposed to analyze them. And the question I was asking myself were, how should a non-indigenous scholar like myself approach this text? What tools to use, which frameworks to apply, and which ones to set aside? And what I follow is Alison Ravenscroft's practice of reading as a welcome stranger. She developed this framework in relation to Australian Indigenous fiction, but she extends it as a reading practice for Indigenous literary text more broadly. Now, she puts it, I am interested in the possibilities of reading practice based in estrangement for the possibilities it might hold for decentering the Western-centric knowing reader subject. The welcome stranger position is an invitation to accept not understanding, to sit with illegibility and uncertainty. It is not easy. To resist the impulse to translate unknown concept into familiar terms. And this is what I used to do at the very beginning. I would translate those concepts. Now, when we encounter a word like Begijigan, an academic reflex is to convert it into an English equivalent, an offering, so the reader can carry on. But the translation assimilates the concept. it removes the relational depth, the community, and the community context that allow the indigenous term to function in ways the English word cannot. To leave the word in its own language, understand it, is part of what reading as a welcome stranger means. The encounter with the indigenous text should not pull the text toward the Western reader, but the other way around. So we should be pulled towards the text. If you read as welcome strangers, our own familiar categories, what growing up means in our case, what a hero is, what time looks like, what community is, what hope is, will become visible constructions rather than universals. In practice, this means prioritizing indigenous scholars over explanations, scholars' own explanations, rather than framing ideas in indigenous texts through Western theory. In today's analysis, I begin with Sara Ahmed. She's not an indigenous scholar, and her affect theory, which can name part of what Dimaline's novel do. When Ahmed reaches her limit, I turn to theorists from across indigenous traditions. And what is important to say is that I attend to specific connections rather than claiming some kind of unified indigenous theoretical position among those scholars. Now, let's turn to the analysis. Sara Ahmed argues that dominant culture produces and classifies certain feelings as normal and others as non-standard, and that those who refuse the happiness script become affect aliens, figures whose feelings are out of alignment with what the culture requires of them. So for her, affect aliens are those who are alienated by virtue how they are affected by the world and how they affect others in the world. Applied to Dimaline's duology, the scholars, the recruiters, the language of recovery from the pandemic of dreamlessness, the bureaucratic calm of extraction, are machinery of the happiness script. Indigenous grief and indigenous attachment to practices the settler state declares obsolete are treated as disorder to be cured. Ahmed also notes that happiness duty is not simply imposed, but institutionally enforced, and those who cannot or will not perform it are marked as obstacles to the collective project of recovery. In Hunting by Stars, Frenchie overhears two watchmen at one of the residential schools talking about indigenous prisoners, and this is what they say. They finally get a chance to provide something to society, to pay us back for centuries of free schools and special privileges, and they are even trying to get out of that. Typical. Oh, leave him, the watchman in front turned his head. He's pretty much just a ziplock for what we need. We just gotta keep the bag from tearing before it's time to break the seal. Now, this dehumanization of the system is the system working exactly as designed. In Hunting by Stars, Dimaline extends this logic to its most devastating outcome in the figure of Mitch, Frenchie's brother. They were separated in childhood. He was later found again inside the school system as a converted agent of the apparatus. Mitch has internalized this happiness script so completely that he performs his voluntarily and uses it to recruit his own brother. He narrates his going away story, and his going away story is the narrative that tells what happened to him after the brothers were separated. And it's called Going Away because it's going away from his community towards the system, towards the settler state. As a counterbalance in the narrative, we have also coming to stories, and those stories are very important for the community. So in the community to which Frenchie belongs, everyone can tell their coming to story. So what happened to them before they became the part of the community. There is no deadline. No one is forced to tell the story. They can tell them on their own terms, whenever they want and if they want it. And what is very important for me, I think, is that sometimes some of them decide not to say anything at all. And this silence is treated as equally important and equally relevant as the stories that are actually told. So going back to Mitch. So he narrates his going away story in the institutional language, passive constructions, bureaucratic euphemism, the calm of a man who has found apparent peace. The system has two goals: extraction of bone marrow and the production of subjects who aid in or perform the extraction voluntarily, which is the second goal, completed. Now, Ahmed, now we are going to have a look at the extraction, the mechanism of extraction of bone marrow, and we are going to have a look at the reasons for failure, why it will not work. So Ahmed diagnoses the apparatus accurately. She cannot, however, and what she cannot do, however, is explain why the apparatus fails on its own terms, and it does fail. The duology stages the failure in 3 registers, each more precise than the last. The first is the simplest. A group of American women have access to the synthetic cure. In the United States, contrary to Canada, it is prohibited for anyone to extract bone marrow from indigenous population. And what they are working on are actually synthetic cures. So some of the people do have access to them. So these women do have access to this synthetic cure. They keep dreaming the same 4 dreams. And this is how they describe it. Damn meds are doing nothing but making us into zombies. Honestly, the same damn 4 dreams every time, every damn time. A loop where a living relation used to be. The system has successfully extracted something from indigenous bodies and delivered it to settler ones and produce, in exchange for that extraction, a fixed repetition. The extracted substance carries no generative capacity because this capacity is relational, not biological. We cannot simply extract it and later on pass it to another person. Dreams multiply and change as the dreamer's relations with land, community, and ancestors change. So several relation, and what remains is a recording. The second register, why this extraction actually fails, concerns the origin of the marrow itself. Now, French's mother tells him that the dreams were not always in the bone. She says, maybe they used to be everywhere, muscles, skin, voice, and then we learned how to hide them better. The hiding happened in the tuberculosis wards, in the first residential schools, each wave of colonial violence forcing a new concealment deeper into the body. The system is extracting the residue of its own ancestors' work. What it reaches for there is precisely because earlier versions of the same project make concealment necessary. Now, finally, it brings us to the third defeat. The system seeks efficient supply. So seeking it, it has turned to children. Their marrow is malleable. The logic goes easier to process, like a jelly-o. But malleability is the wrong selection criterion entirely. The dreams that carry the most relational density are Minerva's dreams and Elder's dreams. A life full swerve of relation crystallized in language and practice. So the residential schools have never been a solution, not in the past, not now. In the novels, what they have become is like a massive apparatus that manages only some symptoms of a deeper problem, which it cannot address and it doesn't address. Even though the extractive marrow might alleviate dreamlessness temporarily, it cannot cure it. So the demand for supply never ends. It needs to be renewed all the time. The system must keep expanding, and every school that runs destroys more of the relational web. That is the only possible cure for the condition. Now, in order to understand why dreaming persists in indigenous communities, I turn now to indigenous scholars. The novels frame settler crisis as a crisis of Dimaline calls felt knowledge, of the capacity to dream and to know together. Millian argues that feelings are not raw emotional data waiting to be processed by academic frameworks. They are, in her words, important projections about what is happening in our lives. They are also culturally mediated knowledges, never solely individual. The felt in felt theory is about the inseparability of feeling and knowing. Her claim is epistemological, not only about emotional expression. That felt knowledge is what the schools are trying to take, and this is something that they are simply incapable of taking. The fire circle scene from the beginning of the lecture, where Mick was telling a story, exemplifies this. When Mick once is telling a story around fire, he is offering to his family circle knowledge infused in emotions, knowledge inseparable from feeling, which exists fully only in transmission. So it is simply impossible to extract it and later on deliver it in a syringe. Now, he's enacting what Nigan Wewidam, James Sinclair, and Ainishiabi, a scholar, refers to as Begijikan, an offering. In our context, it is an offering of knowledge, given in such a way that the receiver also becomes responsible for carrying it forward, passing it to others, not returning it to the giver. In this way, the knowledge multiplies through sharing rather than moving from one person to another. As Sinclair writes, a story can be an offering. Knowledge can be an offering. Mick emphasizes the importance of story when he says, story is a home. It's where we live. It's where we hold everything we'll need to truly survive. Our languages, our people, our land. Liane Betasamosake Simpson, also an Ainishiabi scholar, would say that Mick is wearing his teachings. Wearing does not involve storing knowledge inside a person and transferring it simply to another. Instead, the knowledge is worn, embodied in the practice itself. The phrase comes from elder Edna Manitowami, transmitted through Simpson. Once a person has carried a particular teaching around to the point where they can easily embody that teaching, they then also become responsible for sharing it. When Mick tells story, the listeners are not receiving a lesson or being instructed. They are invited into a relation with their elder and with the knowledge he carries, which is now communal. So what that relational web actually looks like and why it cannot be extracted, the novel shows us in a dream. Rose, so French's partner, dreams of threads extending from her skeleton through her flesh, connecting her to who she was, where she had been and where she belonged. The threads snag when a relation is tangled. They snap when a relation breaks. Following them hand over hand through the dark house, Rose is led into her friend's room. The thread from her chest disappears into an invisible hole at the center of his. She wakes. The words are also caught in the threads. Hand fell off the side. Home held four threads in the angles and nooks of its consonants. The language and relation are physically entangled in the dream web, woven together, inseparable, each carrying the other. This relational web cannot be extracted from one body and administered to another. Every act of system cruelty is targeting something that apparatus cannot name, because naming it would require a framework the system is simply incapable of developing. Now we are going to have a look at French's coming-of-age story. So let me turn to French's arc and to what it reveals about why these novels do not fully fit in the young and adult dystopian tradition. Now, young adult dystopia, as scholars from Kerry Haynes, Tubala Kabasu, and Catherine Roth have established, is a hybrid form. It combines the speculative world building of dystopian fiction with the developmental arc of the Bildungsroman. The result is a politically conscious narrative in which young protagonists, initially compliant with the rules of their society, gradually discover the inconsistencies of the system, grow dissatisfied, and eventually rebel. In young adult dystopia, the protagonist learns to negotiate power and acquires agency. Before I draw the contrast, I would like to focus on what Dimaline's duology shares with young adult dystopia. So the young adult dystopian, the dystopian system in the duology is recognizable. So we have an institutional system that captures and processes a mob population. We have propaganda, recruitment, the bureaucratic cruelty, and banality of the system. We have also the journey, encountering new groups, gathering members and losing them, and all of them are quite common young adult dystopian conventions. Now, the protagonist is also quite recognizable. So the protagonist is a narrative vocalizer. There is romance. So friendship falls in love. The political education, inadequacy of the world the protagonist was raised in. So all of them are also present. The novels also keep the young adult promise about hope. So Monica Hughes said, "You may lead a child into the darkness, but you must never turn off the light." And Dimaline leaves the light on. We are going to analyze what hope she offers further on. The protagonists too share the standard young adult features. young adult dystopian features. Frenchie is awkward. He's sometimes very jealous. Sometimes he's frightened. He's brave when it matters. And he's deeply uncertain as for his place in the world. He has his first love. He has Rose. And he grows over the course of the duology in the ways young adult dystopian readers will recognize. So he becomes more capable, more confident, and more able to act under pressure. These novels, on the one hand, so the duology on the one hand, are recognizably young adult dystopia. And that recognition is part of makes them work. Young readers come to them with genre expectations the books satisfy. Dimaline does not reject young adult dystopia. The reader is brought through the familiar. However, the duology does something the young adult dystopia conventions alone cannot. And now let me name the differences. I would like for you to think about Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, Tris Prior from Divergent, Cassia Reyes from the Match trilogy, or Jonas in The Giver. So each of them undergoes an education in the workings of power. Each of them discovers the system deceptions, and each of them acts to challenge or overthrow it. The system is the obstacle. The protagonist's growth is measured by their capacity to resist, survive, and ultimately transform it. One of the most important characteristics in their coming of age is the acquisition of capacity to act on the world. Now, the contrast with Frenchie is more subtle than it appears. It would be wrong to say that Katniss, and I will be using Katniss as a counterbalance for Frenchie. So it is wrong to say that Katniss acts from individual sovereignty, while Frenchie acts from relation. Katniss volunteers for her sister, while she volunteers for Prim. The decision is not made in the name of a revolutionary agency. It is made for Prim, for her sister. This is a relational act motivated by kinship and love, not by political self-determination. And Frenchie chasing after Rose, or Rose risking herself for her companions. These are also relational acts, also motivated by kinship and love. So at the level of motivation, the neat contrast between the young adult dystopian and indigenous protagonist, it simply breaks down. The difference, however, is not in the motivation, but in what the narrative does with the relational act once it has been made. So I'll be using Katniss here. So Katniss volunteers for Prim, and the novel then takes that initial relational act and transforms it across the books into the trajectory of an individual who becomes the symbol of a revolution. The story is not interested in keeping Katniss within the relational frame she began in. It moves her outward, so toward the political stage, toward the Mockingjay function. The image, her image, the Mockingjay pin, later on the revolution that requires her face. All of this is produced not only by Katniss' choices, but by the apparatus around her. Katniss frequently resists this. She's not always happy. She's uncomfortable about being the Mockingjay. She wants the woods. But the narrative does not let her remain in those relational frames. The story she is in requires a hero, and she's made into one whether she wants it or not. By the end, what she did for Prim has become almost incidental to what she has become for the world. The narrative engine has converted the sister protector into the political symbol. As Cherie Hintz knows, the pursuit of personal growth and autonomy are not merely typical features of young adult dystopian fiction, but are employed by the authors to show how the transitional period of adolescence can be used to emphasize the need of conscious political action. So the political transformation the dystopian plot demands is delivered by an exceptional protagonist whose actions become symbolically charged. The novel needs Katniss. The same is largely true across the genre. Tris is divergent, singular by definition. Jonas is the only one who in the community who can receive memories. So the structural logic of young adult dystopia requires this type of protagonist. Now, French is not that. If he died, the community would suffer, they would grieve, but it would go on. The family could continue without him. Mick would tell his story. Minerva would still carry the language. Rose would still dream her thread dreams. He is loved. He is one of them, but he is not the one without whom the story collapses. This is why French's coming to story occupies as much space as any other protagonist coming to story. This is why Minerva's destruction of the machine is the novel's analytical climax, rather than anything Frenchy does. That is why the close reading I have given you today rests on three characters, on Mick, on Rose, and on Minerva, and not on Frenchy alone. He's not an engine of the plot, the community is. Mick tells Frenchy, no one is more important than anyone else French. The Dimaline narrative refuses the work of producing one main singular hero. There are no moments when Frenchy's relational act gets converted into political symbols. He does not give a speech that becomes a slogan. When he's captured and taken to the schools, the apparatus tries to recruit him, to convert him into another mage, but he refuses. But that refusal is not heroic. It is fidelity to specific relations. Rose, Mick, the family. He keeps on thinking about Mick, about what Mick, his father, and obviously most of all, what Rose would think of him if he followed the system. So he refuses not only in the name of a cause, but also because of who he loves. The community itself does not treat him as exceptional. When he returns to them at the end of Hunting by Stars, they greet him with love and joy, but not as a returning hero. No one is more important than anyone else French. So they absorb him back into the relations he came from. So what then do we get instead of the indispensable hero? So we might call what we get an irreplaceable relation. Every member of the community matters as a person, but the community does not depend on any single one of them. As Dimaline writes, it was one of the most important teachings that they all looked out for one another without hierarchy, without question. So the community is built around the practice of being a community, and that practice can outlast the loss of an individual. What it cannot outlast is the loss of the practice itself. So Frenchy's arc is structured differently from Katniss's. Although they both act out of love, Collins's narrative is built to make Katniss a hero, whether she wants it to be one or not. The Dimaline narrative, in turn, is built to keep Frenchy a relative and to deepen the web of relational obligations he began in. One of the conclusions of Katniss's arc is the burden of having been the Mockingjay. The conclusion of Frenchy's arc is weight, in Mick words, the weight of being in obligation to specific others. So the narrative has been steering him towards this all along, not toward becoming a hero, but toward becoming what Daniel Heath Justice calls a good relative. What that good relative looks like at the end of duology is this. By the end of the sequel, Frenchy has survived the school, survived the conversion of his brother, and returned damaged to the community. Mick says to him, Frenchy, weight is what holds you to the ground, to this ground. Otherwise, you might just blow away. And it can be unbearable unless you remember that our ancestors are there not just to pile onto the load you carry, but also to shoulder some of the weight. Now, finally, to end our encounter with the duology, let's turn to hope. So, what hope does Dimaline propose? The ending of Hunting by Stars does not offer a clean resolution. The family crosses into the United States, pushed south by the Canadian settler state, severed once more from ancestral territory. The dreaming continues, but what the dreams will carry and whose land they will be full of is left open. The answer is not an abstract horizon. It is one more version of the same perseverance, a practice maintained under conditions designed to break it. It is what ancestors have been dreaming toward continuously across dispossession, forced migration, the tuberculosis wards, the interruptions of residential schools, and finally, bone marrow harvesting. When the thread connecting them to their ancestral land snaps, the threads of language, story, and chosen kinship have to hold even more firmly. And in Dimaline's novel, they do. Now, at the beginning of the first novel, she hints at it. She hints at the importance of community and kinship. And the epigraph reads, "For the grandmothers who gave me strength, to the children who gave me hope. It is not one or another. It is grandparents. It is not either grandparents or children. They coexist and are equally important." Now, the duology ends with Rose wrapping a handful of jingles beside newborn Ishkodi. Ishkodi, a child named Fire. Ishkodi was a fighter. And sometimes that's nothing more than the choreography of being born everything the ancestors ever dreamed of. And those ancestors, they never stop dreaming. So Ishkodi arrives into a community capable of dreaming and sustaining the relational web necessary to keep that dreaming alive. A family chosen, tested, and unified across past, present, and future. A community that followed its elders' last words. Minerva's last words to Mink were Kiwen, go home, more a direction than a place. And this is what they did. So here you have, the references. Okay, the primary sources and references. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kasia, for this wonderful reading of these two texts, and also for this kind of meta reflection on young adult literature and speculative fiction more broadly. So now we have time for questions. Anyone from the audience would like to comment? Yes, Nina, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe just a question, if I understood or if I didn't understand what you said about this text by Alison Ravenscroft. Mm-hmm. Did you kind of single out this as a concept, welcomed stranger, as a methodological tool or something like that, or a reader position? Is that how you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry. No, please.
No, sorry. I apologize. Finish, please. Sorry.
No. This was my question.
So when I was approaching one of the first Indigenous texts, I was a little bit lost because I felt like an imposter a little bit because I'm not an Indigenous scholar, I'm not an Indigenous person. So I started to look for the ways of reading those texts. And Alison Ravenscroft, her approach, and she calls it a welcome stranger. She talks exactly about how to read Indigenous texts. And although she writes from Australian perspective, because she's a scholar in Australian Indigenous fiction, she says that her reading practice is quite, I would say, radical. Because she says that we should, and she rather says that we should and have to approach Indigenous texts only through Indigenous scholars. Now, I agree to a certain extent, but at the same time, I think that if we are that strict, then there is little dialogue between Western tradition and Indigenous texts, and I think it is also very important. That's why I kind of used what she was saying. Her reading practice, but at the same time, I thought, okay, why cannot I use Sarah Ahmed? She's not an Indigenous scholar, but the way she approaches feelings, and it describes very well what is happening in the duology. So I think that yes, it is possible to use non-Indigenous scholars, but we have to be very, very cautious, and try to see when they reach certain limit. Because, for example, is it possible to analyze this duology and an Indigenous text without using Indigenous scholars? Of course it is. But what kind of reading we are going to receive is completely different. For me, for example, reading before, while I was reading the novels and reading Indigenous scholars, it was very helpful because without their insight, I wouldn't probably notice some of the intricacies of the plot. So I don't know if I have answered your question, Nina.
Yeah. It was very interesting to learn a little bit more how you have been thinking, because I think it's this is relevant for many reading novels written from an Indigenous perspective, but still perhaps not written. For instance, written in the majority's language, for instance. I think that's a gesture to try to include non-Indigenous readers, of course. So I think it was useful. I guess several scholars struggle with how to behave in a proper way, but still being able to talk or teach or whatever texts that are not written from your own perspective, but still, yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina.
And if I may just have a quick comment as a kind of follow-up on that, I was thinking also of research by Nicola Daly, who is from New Zealand. And she's a white person, a settler, you could say, but she's been working, among others, on multilingual children's literature, and especially children's books that are written they're both in English and Maori, or in Maori. So she's interested in this kind of revitalization of the Maori language. And I remember talking with her about her positionality. So in her case, again, it's different because she's than yours, I imagine, because she's part of that society that is very close, in a very close relationship with the indigenous population, and she's been learning the Maori language. So I think we also should remember about which indigenous, let's say, communities, traditions we are talking about. And of course, you stress that, the Canadian context here. So I'm very much for. I like this idea of a welcomed stranger, but again, problematized and kind of qualified maybe as well, depending on what kind of text we are working on and who we are as scholars.
Also, as a field of Indigenous futurisms, I mean, it's something that is still information. So this is something, it's a very active field. So there are many different perspectives. Some of them are not as restrictive as Alison Ravenscroft. Some of them permit, for example, would say that, yes, it's okay to use, for example, biopolitics to analyze those novels because, it fits perfectly. And I do agree to a certain extent, but I think if we do it, we have to be very cautious and aware that what we are doing in order not to colonize the text, in order not to apply, once again, our perspective onto an Indigenous text. So this is something that is voiced very frequently by Indigenous scholars and Indigenous writers. And also what is Indigenous futurism is very fluid. I don't know if there are any other questions.
Yes, but please, do we have any other comments or questions from the audience? Okay, I can't see any at the moment. Kasia, so if you want to add something, please continue, and then I have a comment, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, but please go on.
So what is an Indigenous futurist text is quite, it is not set in stone. And there was a controversy related to a novel published by American Indigenous writer, Rebecca Roanhorse, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but I might be misremembering her surname. And she wrote a novel, Trail of Lightning. I will have to check also the title. What happened is that she was writing. Her novel was set in Dime or in Navajo tradition. And she's not she is an Indigenous person, but this is not her tribal affiliation. So she was writing from, trying to explain the perspective of a tribe she's not part of. And in spite of the fact that this novel was quite a success, it won quite a lot of, I think it won Nebula Award. So it was very popular, and it was well received. The writers belonging to Navajo tribe, they expressed their discontent with what she did, because they treat it as cultural appropriation, and they didn't agree with some of the characterization of the characters there and of the things that she included. Others said that, we shouldn't approach it like that. So it is still very, very contested field.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments, questions from the audience? Okay, then I will maybe again follow up on reading, right? Reading experience here in this context, if I may. I've been thinking about young readers. You mentioned that these books, well, especially the first one, but I guess the sequel as well, that they have been very well received by young Indigenous readers.
All the readers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
Okay, all right. So I wonder, but I wonder what does it mean? What it means for a young reader, white young reader, especially, to come to these novels. I mean, where is this position that they can? I mean, how do they relate to these texts? I think from the settler's perspective, and that's, I think, I would imagine. I mean, I've read just the first part, and I felt. I remember I felt. I felt this kind of complicity, right? That I think, as a white person, I have more broadly speaking in this ongoing apocalypse. Right, for many Indigenous communities all over the world. So I wonder what can this book tell, or these stories, what they can tell white young readers. What kind of position they occupy. Of course, they are close to the main characters, I would imagine. I mean, there are not, well, main characters is again a problematic term here, but the young characters in the novel, I would imagine. But at the same time, it must be a very unsettling experience, I would imagine, reading
I think
that book.
It depends where the young reader is from. If they are Canadian, in Canada, the process of reconciliation is quite advanced. So there was a commission related to reconciliation, and the history, the colonial history, the history of residential schools is taught at schools. So children, even in preschool and later on in primary school and secondary schools, they are taught colonial history. And they are also taught about Indigenous cultures. So, for example, they travel like school trips and field trips. They go to reservations. They go to different museums. There are meetings with Indigenous, with representatives of First Nations or Métis culture. So in Canada, this is something that is a part of their everyday life. So here, reading such a novel, it adds another layer to it. When an Indigenous child in Canada reads it, once again, this child can feel maybe represented. Now, how children and young adults outside of Canadian context approach it, that's a different story. Because in the United States, for example, this process of reconciliation is basically non-existent. It's not being taught about. It's not being taught. It's not being talked about. So for them, if we talk about a wild child, okay, so let's say settler child, although I really don't like this word and this name. But if we look at non-Indigenous children in the United States reading this novel, or non-Indigenous reading this novel, then they might learn something about the history of their continent, of their country. I don't know whether they will understand it. And what attracts them? I mean, there are in those novels, we have several things that are very popular that made young adult dystopia so popular. So we have this love, but it is different. I mean, it's not like Katniss and what was his name, and Peter, and I have forgotten the name of the other one. Okay, so the other one. So it is not as predominant. This is not as important as in standard and Western young adult dystopias. But there is still this love, and this is what the children and young adults were really interested in. I mean, they were asking questions: what happened to them? What happened to Rose and Frenchie? So I think every child, depending on where they are, can find something different. Now, will they understand? I don't know. It depends on their background and on their background knowledge, but definitely it can introduce them to certain issues that are very relevant.
Yeah, but I think also, well, thinking maybe a little bit more about the Anthropocene and
Yes.
climate crisis, then I think
Yes.
it has this kind of broader appeal, I would say, as well, right? And especially, I would say that this complicity is something that might strike you here, as this kind of relevance. Mm-hmm.
But it is always somewhere in the background. I mean, yes, I mean, it's quite at the beginning. What happened, more or less, but in very, very broad strokes. But later on, it centers more on the survival of continuance, on solidarity, on companionship, on what is important to be a family, to be a community. It is more in the background. What is most important, I think, is this the survival of relations between this chosen family. But obviously, it's like canvas on which the story is has been drawn. So it is definitely important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Do we have any more comments, thoughts, maybe related to this discussion? Okay, so maybe just one more general question from me. Are there any, and forgive my ignorance here, but are there any other texts like this in Canadian literature or American?
When we talk about young adult dystopia, the type of hero that we can see here in Dimaline's novels can be found in other novels as well. But at the same time, we have that's why I was trying not to generalize, just to focus on Dimaline, because there are also those novels in which we have a native, indigenous characters and protagonists that are more like Katniss, and this was the example that I gave you before. The lightning. I'm sorry, I have forgotten the title. So the protagonist is very similar to Katniss. I mean, if we read it along next to Katniss' arc, it will be more similar than Archie's one. So yes, there is a little bit of everything. And right now, I'm trying also to read novels, but it's very complex. Reading Indigenous futurism from different parts of the world, because obviously cultural background is completely different, and reading also Australian Aboriginal texts, but it is very complex. It is very complex.
Okay, thank you very much, Kasia, once again for this wonderful talk. And Ella, I think we can be finishing, right? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much to everyone as well for joining us.
Thank you.